here in Prescott, so I'm gonna try to get a little short stream in here. We're gonna start out with a little bit of this, the hidden history of the American oligarchy.
Throughout 2009, the first year of the administration of America's first black president, the GOP's white racist base was roiling with rage. In the preface to The Hidden History of Guns and the Second Amendment, I tell the story of how just weeks after Barack Obama's election, two of my brothers and I went to a gun range in Mason, Michigan, and it was nearly sold out of ammunition. When I asked why, the guy who was renting me a .40 caliber Ruger but would sell me only 100 rounds of ammunition, bluntly told me it was because that N-word, who was just elected, was going to take away everybody's guns, and folks were getting ready to take on the coming wave of jackbooted thugs from the ATF. Fox News and right-wing talk radio were boiling over with hate and fear, and the fossil fuel oligarchs who'd started a number of causes together with the tobacco industry to fight the Clinton administration knew that their time had come. Jeff Nesbitt, a Republican operative who'd helped start the whole right-wing media machine in 1993, as Bill Clinton was taking office, noted in his biography of the Times, Poison Tea, How Big Oil and Big Tobacco Invented the Tea Party and Captured the GOP, that they'd spent most of the 1990s building infrastructure. They planted, he wrote, deep roots in colleges and universities across the nation to support it intellectually. They opened offices, policy networks, in every state in the Union, each with a different name and ostensibly separate and independent funding, although it was all largely coming from a single integrated source, to influence the state's political systems. A national coordinating group was in place to enforce discipline across states. A propaganda arm was built at both the individual state and national levels that could bring tightly controlled messaging and narratives in a way that looked like independent journalism. From ALEC to the Sam Adams Alliance, to the Franklin Center for Government and Public Integrity, to the State Policy Network, all were up, running, fully staffed, and well-funded. All they needed now were millions of people to show up in the streets to grab headlines, influence legislators, and finally and forever take over the Republican Party. The presidency of Barack Obama, that black man in the White House, provided the perfect catalyst. The Tea Party, first created in the 90s, was relaunched with a small army of rented buses, paid PR flacks, and millions in earned media, that is, cost-free news coverage, across the networks. They railed against Obama's Socialist Affordable Care Act with slogans like, "Keep your government hands off my Medicare." They demanded removal of laws protecting communities from being poisoned by mine runoff and the smokestacks of oil refineries, claiming that regulations are blocking progress. They proclaimed that the acronym for their movement was Taxed Enough Already. And they took over the GOP, paving the way for an oligarch, Donald Trump, to ascend to the nation's highest office. The oligarch's most successful con. More than 75% of Americans trusted the federal government to do what is right during the last years of the Eisenhower administration, straight through John F. Kennedy's time in office, and into the early years of Lyndon Johnson's presidency. Today, only 17% of Americans trust their government. It's so bad that armed protesters have showed up nationwide to protest the tyranny of having to wear masks during a pandemic, and have been cheered on by the President of the United States and major news outlets. This is no accident. It's the result of a decades-long campaign by some of America's richest families to tear apart the governing fabric of our nation, kicked off by their man Ronald Reagan, proudly proclaiming at his January 20th, 1981 inauguration, "Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem." Put yourself in the place of a man who inherited a multi-million-dollar fossil fuel empire from his now-deceased father, a situation akin to the heroic brother and sister who inherited a railroad from their dad in Ayn Rand's novel, Atlas Shrugged. One, if you don't have to pay to dispose of cancer-causing byproducts from your refineries, but can simply vent them into the air, you make more money. 2, if you can cut wages and threaten employees because they don't have a union, you can make more money. 3, if you can run a pipeline across sacred Indian land atop a major national aquifer with minimal safety oversight, you make more money. 4, if you can hide your money from the IRS because the agency has had its budget slashed so badly that it can no longer do expensive audits of morbidly rich people, you can keep more of the money you've made. And 5, if you can get the government to cut social programs and public education, thus lowering your taxes, you can keep more of the money you've made. So how do you pull this off when every one of these things hurts average Americans? Easy. Just embark on a 40-year-long campaign through think tanks, right-wing media, and massive PR efforts to convince average Americans that government is the cause of, not the solution to, their problems. Convince working-class Americans that gutting government is a good thing that will ultimately help them in some mystical, magical way through the incredible invisible hand of the marketplace. Tobacco lawyer Lewis Powell launched the movement to do just this with his infamous memo in 1971, and billionaires have funded and promoted politicians who jump on board the government is evil bandwagon ever since. And it's largely worked, if the trust in government statistics compiled by the Pew Center from 1958 to today are accurate. A decade or so ago, I was up late one night watching Bloomberg News on a hotel TV. The American host was interviewing a very, very wealthy German businessman at some sort of conference in Singapore. Amidst questions about the business climate in the conference, the host asked the businessman what tax rate he was suffering under in his home country. As I recall, the businessman said, a bit over 60% when everything is included. How can you handle that? Asked the host, incredulous. The German shrugged his shoulders and moved the conversation to another topic. A few minutes later, the American reporter, still all wound up by the tax question, again asked the businessman how he could possibly live in a country with such a high tax rate on very wealthy and successful people. Again, the German deferred and changed the subject. The reporter went for a third try. Why don't you lead a revolt against those high taxes? He asked, his tone implying that the businessman was badly in need of some good old American rebellion making. The German businessman paused for a long moment, then leaned forward, putting his elbows on his knees, his clasped hands in front of him, pointing at the reporter as if in prayer. He stared at the man for another long moment, and then, in the tone of voice that an adult uses to correct a spoiled child, he said simply, I don't want to be a rich man in a poor country. There are very few wealthy Americans who understand this, but the billionaires who fund the Republican Party and right-wing media think it's perfectly fine to rip the financial and political guts out of their own nation if it makes them a few extra bucks. They funded and facilitated movements like the Tea Party and the Boogaloo Boys, media outlets like Fox News and Breitbart, and activist organizations like the Federalist Society, the Heritage Foundation, and ALEC. They throw piles of money at Republican politicians, so long as those politicians never stray far from the deregulate, cut, denigrate line about American government. Crisis. When, in 2015, I asked former President Jimmy Carter what he thought the consequences were of Supreme Court decisions like Buckley and Citizens United that made all this possible, he replied, it, referring to the Citizens United decision, violates the essence of what made America a great country in its political system. Now it's just an oligarchy, with unlimited political bribery being the essence of getting the nominations for president or to elect the president. And the same thing applies to governors and U.S. senators and Congress members. So now we've just seen a complete subversion of our political system as a payoff to major contributors who want and expect and sometimes get favors for themselves after the election's over. The incumbents, Democrats and Republicans, look upon this unlimited money as a great benefit to themselves. Somebody who's already in Congress has a lot more to sell to an avid contributor than somebody who's just a challenger. That same year, then Vice President Joe Biden said, you have to go where the money is. Now, Where the money is, there's almost always implicitly some string attached. It's awful hard to take a whole lot of money from a group you know has a particular position, then you conclude they're wrong and vote no. As former Vice President Al Gore wrote in his 2013 book, The Future: 6 Drivers of Global Change, American democracy has been hacked. The United States Congress is now incapable of passing laws without permission from the corporate lobbies and other special interests that control their campaign finances. And in 2015, campaigning for the Republican nomination for president, Donald Trump candidly said during the August 6th debate, "I gave to many people before 2 months ago. I was a businessman. I give to everybody. When they call, I give. And do you know what? When I need something from them 2 years later, 3 years later, I call them,
Hey, what's going on,
and they are there for me." As noted earlier, researchers Martin Gillens and Benjamin Page demonstrated.
What's up, Charles? How you doing? I was up there trying to do a little cleaning. Thank you for dropping in. I'm doing pretty good. Ain't no need to complain.
The United States ceased to be a functioning democracy, by classical definitions, sometime during the Reagan years, and has been, as Jimmy Carter said, an oligarchy. My term, not theirs. They call it economic elite domination since then. The difference between now and the 1860s is that the oligarchic control is no longer regional. It's national. The Coke oligarchy machine, for example, has branches in every state and pretty much every county. Oligarchy supporting media are ubiquitous. And now, very serious people are talking about the possibility of a second civil war. But it won't just be a war of white supremacists and Trump cultists against the rest of us, as is generally thought. It will be a war between those comfortable with oligarchy, indeed embracing it, as it promises them safety and stability, versus those who believe in democracy. In literature, story structure from the time when Aristotle explicitly identified it to today follows a predictable arc. The lead character experiences an event that throws his life out of balance, referred to as the inciting incident. This is followed by repeated, and repeatedly unsuccessful, attempts by our hero to get his life back to normalcy. Each, instead, pushes him further and further away from where he started, with a series of progressive complications, making things worse and worse. Finally, the lead character is faced with a terrible choice, a crisis that he knows will forever change his life. To address this choice, the most consequential of his life, he must reach deep inside himself for meaning, inspiration, and a connection to his true values. Whether it's Luke Skywalker or Captain Ahab, he knows his life will never be the same, and indeed, when he makes his terrible choice, he becomes a different, new person. America has arrived at this crisis point, and we must make a choice. This crisis goes way beyond simply electing a particular president or having control of Congress. Every nature of our republic has been under continuous oligarchic assault since the Reagan Revolution, reaching a head in the Trump administration. This time, we will either succumb to oligarchy and flip or limp into tyranny, or we will reject oligarchy and return to the principles of democracy and pluralism on which this country was founded. Will we be a nation that provides for the needs of our people, or continue to shovel our nation's wealth to the top 1%? Will we, like every other advanced democracy, recognize high-quality education and healthcare as rights, or continue to hold them as privileges, enjoyed by only the wealthy few? Will we hand the levers of democratic power to all our citizens, or keep them in a small number of wealthy and overwhelmingly white hands? Will we once again become to the world that shining city on a hill that John Winthrop spoke of in 1630, or will we continue to deteriorate through our present oligarchy into full-blown tyranny? This is a crisis point for our nation, as real and critical as those we hit in 1776, 1861, and 1932. In each of those three cases, the oligarchs lost the battle. This time, they could win. 2. How oligarchy led to the Civil War. America's revolutionary founders best laid plans for liberty, ending American slavery. When you read through James Madison's notes on the Constitutional Convention, it's striking how not one single member, even from the southern states, stood up to argue that slavery was a good thing. No doubt all were deeply marinated in white supremacy, and many were open advocates of that cause. But the spirit of the time, at least, prevented them from promoting those views in the context of the new country about to be born. The only outlier was South Carolina's Charles Pinckney, a plantation and slave owner, who argued that slaves were present in the Bible and the Roman Republic, and if the Constitution outlawed the practice, his state and Georgia probably would not sign the document. It kicked off a debate that he quickly backed away from. In large part, these Southern politicians were unwilling to defend slavery because they didn't have the political power to stand up to the emerging generation of idealists, particularly those from the border states and the North, where there were large and active abolition movements. Even Patrick Henry, Virginia's largest slaveholder, expounded at length in numerous venues during that era about the evils of slavery and the absolute need for America to gradually and safely eliminate the practice. When they spoke of the issue, the representatives from the southern states largely argued against economic disruption or claimed their own right to hang on, at least temporarily, to an economic and political system into which they themselves had been born. But the majority of the Constitution's framers were not slaveholders, and they, and some of the slaveholders, were ready to move on from slavery and toward a more egalitarian nation. On August 8, 1787, the assembled delegates to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia took up Article 4, Section 2 of the Constitution. The southern states were a generation away from sliding into oligarchic control, more on that in a moment, but still considered slavery central to their economies. When a discussion of taxing exports that were the product of slavery, mostly cotton, came up, Gouverneur Morris of New York used the moment to point out how slavery had a terrible effect on local government, local economy, and the standard of life for all the white people of a slave state, except the plantation owners. James Madison, a Virginia slave owner, took notes on Morris's speech, capturing the essence of his remarks. He never would concur in upholding domestic slavery, Madison wrote of Morris. It was a nefarious institution. It was the curse of heaven on the states where it prevailed. Compare the free regions of the Middle States, where a rich and noble cultivation marks the prosperity and happiness of the people, with the misery and poverty which overspread the barren wastes of Virginia, Maryland, and the other states having slaves. Travel through ye whole continent, and you behold the prospect continually varying with the appearance and disappearance of slavery. The moment you leave the eastern states and enter New York, the effects of the institution become visible. Passing through the Jerseys and entering Pennsylvania, every criterion of superior improvement witnesses the change. Proceed southwardly, and every step you take through the great regions of slaves presents a desert increasing with the increasing proportion of these wretched beings. The vassalage of the poor has ever been the favorite offspring of aristocracy. Madison cited Connecticut's Roger Sherman. He observed that the abolition of slavery seemed to be going on in the United States, and that the good sense of the several states would probably by degrees complete it. Virginia's George Mason, himself a slaveholder, rose to say, "Slavery discourages arts and manufactures. The poor despise labor when performed by slaves. They produce the most pernicious effect on manners. Every master of slaves is born a petty tyrant. They bring the judgment of heaven on a country. By an inevitable claim of causes and effects, Providence punishes national sins by national calamities." Oliver Ellsworth was emphatic. As population increases, poor laborers will be so plenty as to render slaves useless. Slavery in time will not be a speck in our country. William Patterson said, "Where slavery exists, the Republican theory becomes still more fallacious." And indeed, the sentiment against slavery was widespread across the colonies. The year after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, Vermont, which was then a sovereign nation, modified its constitution to ban slavery. Pennsylvania passed a law initiating the emancipation of slaves in that state in 1780. New Hampshire and Massachusetts followed Vermont's lead in 1783, although by court rulings in both states, and the process spread down the eastern seaboard to New York and New Jersey by the turn of the century. As that era's abolition movement spread southward, it achieved tidal wave proportions during the founders' lifetimes. Delaware slave owners freed their slaves in Slavery is legal in the United States in 2021. Popular belief holds that the 13th Amendment, passed just a few weeks before Christmas in 1865, ended slavery in the United States. It didn't. Instead, it merely limited slavery to one particular slice of our population, and as a result, humans are held today in actual slavery in this country. The 13th Amendment says, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the parties shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction." The "except" was a huge loophole and explains why America has more people in prison than any other country on earth, at over 2.1 million prisoners, far more than twice those held by the entire European Union, which has roughly 100 million more citizens than the United States. Additionally, another 7 million Americans are under some form of correctional supervision today, meaning that they can be pushed back into slave labor often for the smallest infraction. America imprisons about 430 out of every 100,000 of our people. For comparison, Japan imprisons 39, Iceland 37, Finland 53, Norway 60, Sweden 61, the Netherlands 63, Germany and Denmark 61 each, and the UK 77. It explains why multiple billion-dollar companies have jumped into the for-profit prison business. Prison labor,
That's 100% fact, boo.
modern-day slave labor, illegal in every other developed country in the world, is, like the slave labor of old, incredibly profitable, whether those imprisoned slaves are making furniture, assembling electronics, or picking cotton. We also have tens of millions of disposable people, including people of color and poor whites, who act as a sort of economic and political shock absorber for U.S. companies and politicians. When the periodic recessions that afflict the American economy happen every 6 to 9 years or so, these are the people who are first to be laid off, and when recoveries start, they are the last to be hired. As such, they buffer middle and upper income Americans, overwhelmingly white, from the shocks of the cycles of our particularly brutal form of laissez-faire capitalism. These two systems keep the money flowing to American oligarchs, while preventing an uprising among the somewhat more privileged portion of the white middle class. Through debt, oligarchs can still own people. 2,000 years ago, Publius Cyrus wrote, "Debt is the slavery of the free." A bit over a century ago, Ambrose Bierce defined debt as an ingenious substitute for the chain and whip of the slave driver. The lesson hasn't been lost on modern American oligarchs. If labor unions and workers' cooperatives represent the most empowered form of labor, tyrants modify the very language of a culture. In 1990, Newt Gingrich pioneered a transformation in the way the conservative vassals of America's oligarchs would use political power. Instead of talking about policies, philosophy, and ideas, they would simply label liberals as, essentially, evil, and themselves as good. It dramatically simplified office holding, paving the way for all-in oligarchs like Mitch McConnell, Donald Trump, and their toadies like Bill Barr to ignore the consequences of their actions so long as they were elegantly messaged. Gingrich laid this out in a memo for Republican officeholders titled Language, a Key Mechanism of Control. In it, he carried on from Joseph Goebbels, who had repeatedly asserted that in order to control a society, one must first take control of that society's language. Gingrich gave Republicans a list of words to describe anything having to do with Democrats. It read in part, decay, failure, collapse, deeper, crisis, urgent, destructive, destroy, sick, pathetic, lie, liberal, they or them, unionized bureaucracy, compassion is not enough, betray, consequences, limit, shallow, traitors, sensationalists, endanger, coercion, hypocrisy, radical, threaten, devour, waste, corruption, incompetent, permissive attitude, destructive, impose, self-serving, greed, ideological, insecure, anti-flag, family, child, jobs, pessimistic, excuses, intolerant, stagnation, welfare, corrupt, selfish, insensitive, status quo, mandate taxes, spending, shame, disgrace, punish, bizarre, cynicism, cheat, steal, abuse of power, machine, bosses, obsolete, criminal rights, red tape, patronage. Gingrich told Republicans that it was as important to characterize themselves in a positive light as it was to trash talk Democrats. His list of words to apply to themselves and their policies was as follows: share, change, opportunity, legacy, challenge, control, truth, moral, courage, reform, prosperity, crusade, movement, children, family, debate, compete, active, we, us, our, candid, humane, pristine, provide, liberty, commitment, principled, unique, duty, precious, premise, caring, tough, listen, learn, help, lead, vision, success, empower, citizen, activist, mobilize, conflict, light, dream, freedom, peace, rights, pioneer, proud or pride, building, preserve, pro-flag, children, environment, reform, workfare, eliminate good time in prison, strength, choice or choose, fair, protect, confident, incentive, hard work, initiative, common sense, passionate. All over the country through the 1990s, Republican politicians proudly memorized his list and used his words as often as possible in speeches, writings, and media appearances. They also began to refer to the Democratic Party, founded and named by Thomas Jefferson, as the Democrat Party. There is, of course, no such thing as a Democrat Party. But in the 1950s, Joe McCarthy told Republicans that Democratic sounded too nice, and they should instead always say Democrat Party, with an emphasis on the rat. The entire Republican Party, along with Fox News and right-wing hate radio, adopted this usage in 2009 after Barack Obama was elected. And now the phrase even makes its way into mainstream news reports, written by young reporters who apparently don't know the correct name of the party. When tyranny begins to emerge, shifts in language become obvious, and it's important to pay close attention to how language is used, especially when certain phrases or memes are used repeatedly. Tyrants understand that it's more important to control the news than to control the army. Armies will follow what they believe to be true, but only when first convinced of its truth. And that requires control of, or substantial influence over, the news.
Girl, you know I already know you be in the house.
Look at how Trump spent 3 years demonizing the media while telling police to treat people with abuse. What followed was the specific targeting of reporters across the nation in the summer of 2020 by police firing rubber bullets, which kill 2% of the time and permanently maim 18% of the time, blinding one reporter and seriously injuring dozens of others, as well as using tear gas and bone-breaking clubs and batons. Pay special attention to his language. Fake news, America first, enhanced interrogation, voter fraud, rapists and murderers, welfare queen, big government, Christian, and pro-life are all terms the GOP has twisted to their ends. They use the word freedom to describe an end to taxes on the rich, and liberty to describe a willingness to subvert society and the rule of law. History shows that this manipulation of language rarely ends well. Deconstruct the state. For tyranny to overcome a republic, it must first dismantle institutions of governance, so that it can replace them with its own tyranny-supporting people and systems. Government, itself an institution, is in reality made up of many smaller institutional entities, each created to achieve a singular purpose. The Environmental Protection Agency protects the environment. The Food and Drug Administration makes sure that our food is safe and our drugs are pure. The Internal Revenue Service collects taxes, and delivers them to fund the functions of government. These government agencies also serve as a check on the power of the nation's oligarchs. As tyrannies emerge out of oligarchy, they always first corrupt the individual institutions of governance. In this, they are usually joined with groups whose interests are regulated, controlled, or advanced or constrained by those institutions. Since the 1980s, Republicans have made a practice of moving large numbers of lobbyists and industry executives into senior positions in regulatory agencies. Trump, for example, installed a coal lobbyist to be in charge of the Interior Department, an oil lobbyist to be in charge of the EPA, an anti-union lobbyist to be in charge of the Labor Department, a former tech industry lobbyist as director of national intelligence, a defense contractor lobbyist to be in charge of the Pentagon, a former student loan industry executive as the federal student loan watchdog, and a former Verizon lawyer to be in charge of the FCC, which regulates Verizon. Even his response to COVID-19 was run by Alex Azar, the former CEO of a pharmaceutical company that doubled its price for insulin during Azar's tenure. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. In most agencies, even obscure ones, industry agents were put in charge, or the agencies had their funding slashed. Former White House chief strategist and Breitbart News exec, Steve Bannon, once said that his and Trump's main job was the deconstruction of the administrative state. That's geek speak for tearing down the US government. And with thousands of jobs across the federal government empty, the goal has largely been accomplished. Meanwhile, most members of Congress, the entire GOP, and about half of the Democratic Party have been co-opted by big money interests, working openly for oligarchy. And with the help of multimillionaire oligarch Mitch McConnell, the entire federal judiciary has been reshaped, including the Supreme Court. In this fashion, authoritarians deconstruct government to enfeeble its protections for its citizens and empower those who would prey on those citizens. Scapegoating to dilute the outrage. Tyrants are notorious for blaming their opponents for doing the very things the tyrants do. It's a very effective technique to redirect and dilute outrage or concern focused on the tyrant, shifting it to their victims. Mussolini and Hitler famously accused Jews and communists of trying to seize power to overthrow the state, when they themselves were doing that very thing. Trump similarly accused his political opponents of election fraud, corruption, and deceit, when in fact he, McConnell, and the GOP were aggressively practicing those dark arts. Republicans, after consistently voting to deny the State Department funding to harden outposts like Benghazi, held years of show trials, accusing Secretary of State Hillary Clinton of causing the deaths that occurred there, even though far more State Department employees had died in overseas attacks during the Bush administration. Similarly, while more than 5 million emails from the Bush administration were lost when their private email domain was shut down and scrubbed after it was suggested that those emails might show that Bush and Vice President Dick Cheney were warned about Osama bin Laden, but chose to ignore the warnings, the GOP spent years trashing Clinton over 30,000 private emails she chose not to share with Congress. Since then, first daughter Ivanka Trump and her husband, Jared Kushner, used private email extensively while working in the White House, as did Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Show trials and accusations designed to deflect blame or focus are ancient techniques of tyrants. Scapegoating race, religion, gender. It's an axiom of fiction that the hero can be only as good as the villain is bad. It goes all the way back to the Greek classics. For example, when Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster invented Superman in 1933, they simultaneously invented Lex Luthor and Kryptonite. If Superman hadn't had a supervillain to fight, the story would have been simply boring. Superman stops a drugstore robbery, then a bank robbery, then catches a killer, etc. Boring. This lesson has never been lost on the world's tyrants and wannabe tyrants. Hitler followed Tsar Nicholas II in turning the Jews into an all-powerful international force that bent nations to their will. Rodrigo Duterte of the Philippines did it with drug dealers. For Erdogan, Saddam Hussein of Iraq, and Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia, it was secularists and Shiites. For Richard Nixon, it was hippies and blacks, as it was for Ronald Reagan, although he expanded that to include welfare queens, and during the AIDS crisis, gays. George W. Bush drove up his approval numbers by going after Muslim terrorists, as did several election cycles of Republican politicians in that era. Right-wing radio commentator Rush Limbaugh was always fond of trashing feminazis, ultimately running faux ads about the Hillary Clinton nutcracker. Trump, whose father was once arrested at a Klan rally, spent his life denigrating and discriminating against African Americans. He knew who the bad guys were and shouted it loud when 5 black teenagers were falsely accused of attacking a white woman in Central Park in 1989, an effort for which he was richly rewarded in the white-run media of that time. Politically, he kicked off his campaign by demonizing Mexicans, but within the first year of his presidency, America heard him warn of supervillains like caravans of brown people from Central America, Mexican murderers and rapists, immigrants from shithole countries like Haiti, and people working against fascism under the banner of Antifa, short for anti-fascist. In each case, Trump presented the people he was demonizing as nearly superhuman. They were such a danger and could cause so much damage to America that he had to declare national emergencies, first to stop them at the southern border, and later to stop protests in the wake of George Floyd's murder. Into that latter mix stepped Arkansas Republican Senator Tom Cotton, who, evidence indicates, wants someday to be president. Writing in the New York Times, he warned America about bands of looters who drove exotic cars along with nihilist criminals simply out for loot and the thrill of destruction, with cadres of left-wing radicals like Antifa. Shades of Lex Luthor. If Donald Trump fails in his aspiration to exploit white America's racism to become our first American tyrant, it's only because of his mediocre intellect and general incompetence. But he won't be the last to try. Normalizing outrageous behavior. Tyranny doesn't generally leap forward out of nothing. Incremental changes over time prepare the soil, and one day it hits a tipping point with enough destruction of institutions, enough cynicism among the populace, and enough of a shift in wealth and power away from the people and into the hands of the very, very wealthy supporters of tyranny. One of the good Germans, whom Milton Mayer interviewed for his book, They Thought They Were Free, told him the following. You see, one doesn't see exactly where or how to move. Believe me, this is true. Each act, each occasion is worse than the last, but only a little worse. You wait for the next, and the next. You wait for the one great shocking occasion, thinking that others, when such a shock comes, will join with you in resisting somehow. You don't want to act or even to talk alone. You don't want to go out of your way to make trouble. Why not? Well, you are not in the habit of doing it. And it is not just fear of standing alone that restrains you. It is also genuine uncertainty. Uncertainty is a very important factor, and instead of decreasing as time goes on, it grows. In the university community, in your own community, you speak privately to your colleagues, some of whom certainly feel as you do. But what do they say? They say, it's not so bad, or you're seeing things, or you're an alarmist. But the one great shocking occasion, when tens or hundreds or thousands will join with you, never comes. That's the difficulty. If the last and worst act of the whole regime had come immediately after the first and the smallest, thousands, yes, millions would have been sufficiently shocked. If, let us say, the gassing of the Jews in 43 had come immediately after the German firm stickers on the windows of non-Jewish shops in 33. But of course, this isn't the way it happens. In between come all the hundreds of little steps, some of them imperceptible, each of them preparing you not to be shocked by the next. Step C is not so much worse than step B. And if you did not make a stand at step B, why should you at step C? And so on, to step D. Tyrants always corrupt police. On April 23, 2018, the Washington Post's Michael Gerson wrote a column titled, ICE has become Trump's personal bullying squad. Gerson called ICE Trump's Praetorian Guard, referring to the private security details employed by Roman generals and emperors, who swore loyalty to the individual for whom they worked, rather than to the state. Having campaigned on demonizing brown-skinned immigrants, Trump found it easy to commandeer ICE forces to his own ends. 2 years later, in July 2020, ICE announced that they were opening a 6-week Citizens Academy course to train civilians in defensive tactics, firearms familiarization, and targeted arrests. Anybody familiar with the history of Hitler's brown shirts, which started out as citizen-based private security for his rallies in the 1920s and ended up as the infamous stormtroopers, must have gotten chills reading the story announcing this in Newsweek. For Dick Cheney, it was the CIA, although their operations were almost entirely confined to overseas torture sites, Guantanamo. In both cases, the awesome police powers of the state, the only group that can legally kill Americans outside of homicide proceedings, were directed to political rather than public safety ends. The SS started out in 1925 as Hitler's bodyguards. When he'd fully risen to power, they became, as Encyclopedia Britannica says, scapegoating race, religion, gender. It's an axiom of fiction that the hero can be only as good as the villain is bad. It goes all the way back to the Greek classics. For example, when Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster invented Superman in 1933, they simultaneously invented Lex Luthor and Kryptonite. If Superman hadn't had a supervillain to fight, the story would have been simply boring. Superman stops a drugstore robbery, then a bank robbery, then catches a killer, etc. Boring. This lesson has never been lost on the world's tyrants and wannabe tyrants. Hitler followed Tsar Nicholas II in turning the Jews into an all-powerful international force that bent nations to their will. Rodrigo Duterte of the Philippines did it with drug dealers. For Erdogan, Saddam Hussein of Iraq, and Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia, it was secular.
Raiding the apartment, destroying the fixtures, and throwing the family's belongings out the window onto the lawn where they were set ablaze. The officers present arrested no one. Time magazine reported that the police acted like ushers, politely handling the overflow at a football stadium. Governor Adlai Stevenson mobilized the National Guard to restore order. Although 118 rioters were arrested, a Cook County grand jury did not indict a single one. The grand jury, however, did indict Harvey Clark, his real estate agent, his NAACP attorney, and the white landlady who rented the apartment to him, as well as her attorney, on charges of inciting a riot and conspiring to lower property values. 36 years later, when an African-American family again attempted Chapter 10, Suppressed Incomes. Common explanation for de facto segregation is that most black families could not afford to live in predominantly white middle-class communities, and still are unable to do so. African-American isolation, the argument goes, reflects their low incomes, not de jure segregation. Racial segregation will persist until more African Americans improve their educations and then are able to earn enough to move out of high poverty neighborhoods. The explanation at first seems valid, but we cannot understand the income and wealth gap that persists between African Americans and whites without examining governmental policies that purposely kept black incomes low throughout most of the 20th century. Once government implemented these policies, economic differences became self-perpetuating. It is not impossible, but it is rare for Americans, black or white, to have a higher rank in the national income distribution than their parents. Everyone's standard of living may grow from generation to generation, but an individual's relative income, how it compares to the incomes of others in the present generation, is remarkably similar to how his or her parents' incomes compared to others in their generation. So an account of de jure residential segregation has to include not only how public policy geographically separated African Americans from whites, but also how federal and state labor market policies, with undisguised racial intent, depressed African American wages. In addition, some, and perhaps many, local governments taxed African Americans more heavily than whites. The effects of these government actions were compounded because neighborhood segregation itself imposed higher expenses on African American than on white families, even if their wages and tax rates had been identical. The result? Smaller disposable incomes and fewer savings for black families, denying them the opportunity to accumulate wealth and contributing to make housing in middle-class communities unaffordable. If government purposely depressed the incomes of African Americans, with the result that they were priced out of mainstream housing markets, then these economic policies are also important parts of the architecture of de jure segregation. 1. Till long after emancipation from slavery, most African Americans were denied access to free labor markets and were unable to save from wages. This denial of access was another badge of slavery that Congress was duty-bound to eliminate, not to perpetuate. Following the Civil War, and intensifying after Reconstruction, a sharecropping system of indentured servitude perpetuated aspects of the slave system.
Well, my loves, I think I'm going to go ahead and call it a night. Hope y'all enjoyed that. If so, hit the like button, share, subscribe, drop a comment. Holla at your girl. Leave a comment in the comment section, all right?